In the early 1980s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan, with my family. My father believed that seeing the world would help my brother and me grow into better men, and now, looking back, I think he was right. Living in the military gave me experiences and exposure to cultures that many people never encounter, and I'm grateful for each one of them, even the terrifying ones. During our time in Japan, my father wanted us to fully immerse ourselves in the culture, so instead of living on the military base, we moved into a small Japanese neighborhood. Our house stood at the top of a steep hill in a cul-de-sac that offered a strange and unique view. On one side, it overlooked a sprawling zoo, and on the other, a large cemetery. Our house was positioned just above the zoo's monkey habitats, with dense jungle-like vegetation separating us from them. The local children and I would often explore this wild jungle, disregarding the warnings about poisonous snakes and leftover mines from World War II. We were the only American family in the cul-de-sac, surrounded by welcoming Japanese families. The kids embraced us, and though we didn't speak the same language fluently, we found ways to communicate. One of our neighbors was an elderly couple who lived in a home surrounded by a beautiful garden. The woman, who insisted we call her Mama-san, often invited us over to help her tend to her plants. She would lure us with offers of green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We adored her. She was warm and generous, as were most of our neighbors. It was a wonderful place to live. However, the cemetery that lay below her home was unlike any I'd ever seen before. In Okinawa, burials were rare due to limited space on the island, so families constructed above-ground crypts. These crypts were large, with arched stone slabs, placed over a square base that had a cutout section for coffins. The stone slabs left a ledge where families could leave offerings, yen, flowers, incense, and food, for their deceased loved ones. The valley below Mama-san's home was filled with these crypts, and old stone stairways wound their way through them, though many were broken or overgrown with vegetation. One evening, Mama-san invited me to visit her alone. She said she had something important to share, but only with me, the eldest brother. Feeling a bit proud, I followed her to the back of her garden, where she led me to a carved wooden bench. As I sat down, she brought out a tray of green tea and sweet rice cakes. The sky was turning shades of pink and orange as the sun began to set. Mama-san explained that she had seen me and the neighborhood kids daring each other to walk through the cemetery at night. The narrow, broken stairway leading down was treacherous, but the true test was how long we could stand to walk among the crypts in the darkness. Mama-san wanted me to understand why that was a terrible idea. She began to tell me a story from the war. During World War II, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as monstrous devils who would kill innocent civilians for no reason. This fear drove some citizens, especially farmers and young men, to take up arms, but others ran, terrified. With nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens chose to throw themselves from cliffs rather than face what they believed to be certain torture at the hands of the American soldiers. I was horrified to hear this. The sadness of the story hit me hard, and I began to cry. Mama-san gently held my hand and assured me that this was in the past, and that we remember the past to avoid repeating it. She continued with her tale. One woman had thrown herself from the cliff with her 2 young children. Though her children died, the woman survived, waking months later from a coma. When she regained consciousness, she was devastated to find herself alone. Her children had been buried somewhere in the cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt shared with many others. Desperate and grieving, the woman searched the cemetery day and night, calling out for her children. But her despair overwhelmed her, and eventually, she threw herself into the ocean in hopes of reuniting with them in the afterlife. But she didn't find peace. According to legend, her act of suicide doomed her soul to wander in torment, forever searching for her children. By this time, the sun had disappeared, and the cemetery was shrouded in darkness. The dim, broken lights along the paths barely illuminated the crypts below. Mama-san pointed to the cemetery, her voice low. "She still wanders," she whispered. "You can hear her crying." I looked down, though I didn't want to. There, in the distant darkness of the cemetery, I saw a figure. It shimmered white, moving slowly among the crypts. I could hear the faint sound of crying, soft at first, but then growing into low moans of anguish. Fear washed over me, but Mama-san held my hand tightly. reassuring me that the spirit wouldn't come close. We were too far away. But that was why we should never venture down there after dark. People who didn't know her story called her the White Witch, which only angered her. Mama-san said it was best to leave her alone and pray for her in hopes that one day she might find peace. Needless to say, I never went down to the cemetery after that, and I never sat with Mama-san at the back of her garden again. The experience had left me shaken. Years later, I visited a place called Peace Prayer Park, once known as Suicide Hill. I cried as I walked through it, praying for the souls of those lost during the war. The warmth and kindness of the Japanese people stayed with me, and the memories of Okinawa became some of the most profound of my life. I still wonder if she's there, wandering the cemetery, searching for her children. In 2003, I bought my first house, and I was absolutely over the moon with excitement. It felt like a dream come true. Not long after moving in, two of my neighbors began teasing me about a supposed ghost in the house. Thinking they were just joking, I played along, pretending I had seen it too and that it was no big deal. But as the summer went on and I met more of my neighbors, the topic of the ghost kept coming up. Eventually, I asked a kind elderly woman who lived on the block about the house. She seemed trustworthy, so I figured she wouldn't mess with my head. She shared the story with me. The previous owner had purchased the house but never lived there because she believed it was haunted. There had been reports of footsteps and sobbing sounds at night, and sightings of a man sitting in the kitchen, covered in blood. One of my neighbors, who had helped with the house's renovations, told me he had felt something lift his dreadlocks while putting up drywall. Though I had experienced paranormal events before, it had been years, and I had chalked them up to night terrors. One day, I went to a small neighborhood video store to rent a movie. As I filled out a form with my demographic and credit card information, the owner glanced at the form and gasped. "Oh my God, you live in that house," she exclaimed. I was curious and asked her what she meant. She explained that one of her former employees had committed suicide in my house. She had gone to the house as soon as she heard about it, but by then, the police had already taped it off as a crime scene. The story was heartbreaking. The employee had moved into the house with his partner and planned to come out to his mother. This was in the early 90s when being gay was a much bigger deal. When he called his mother to invite her over, she disowned him over the phone. That same week, he received a letter confirming that he had tested positive for HIV, which at the time was considered a death sentence. Devastated, he sat at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since then, the video store owner had experienced several paranormal occurrences at her store, including videos flying and even levitating off shelves. I hadn't experienced anything quite like that, but there were strange things, sounds at night, the sound of Cheerios being poured into a bowl, I don't even eat cereal, and soft sobbing from the kitchen. I often woke up to these sounds. I remembered my grandmother once telling me, "When the dead come to you, they want something. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them." So I decided to try. One night, I sat down at the kitchen table, lit a candle, and told the spirit that I would pray a novena for him every night before the candle. I chose Saint Anthony, the patron saint of lost souls. On the 9th night of the first novena, I heard uncontrollable sobbing. It was accompanied by a heavy presence, filled with grief and despair. The sound of hyperventilating breathing filled the room, like someone struggling to catch their breath. I sat there, feeling the intensity of this presence, but I wasn't afraid. It wasn't malicious. Rather, it felt like a deep connection, an intimate moment of shared sorrow. For 45 days, I prayed a novena for him before the lit candle. I also had a mass said in his name. Occasionally, I would wake up and feel his presence standing over my bed, but I knew it wasn't harmful. Over time, these visits became less frequent, but every now and then, I still feel him, lingering quietly, seeking solace in the peace I've tried to offer. I was 2 years old when this eerie event occurred, and I have no memory of it. My mother only told me the story a few years ago, just before my wedding when I was 32. The details still haunt her. She had been raised in a small fundamentalist Christian community where there was no room for belief in ghosts or spirits. Even after 3 decades, she whispered the story with a pale, terrified face, a stark contrast to her usual loud, confident tone. This is a woman who never talked about the paranormal, so I believed her completely. Looking back, I'm grateful I can't remember. In 1988, my parents welcomed my brother Victor alias into the family, and with 2 babies, our rented flat became too cramped. To solve the space issue, they decided to move to an old, sprawling 2-story farmhouse on 7 acres in southern Ohio. The house was in the middle of nowhere, nearly an hour from town. My mom said the first time I saw it, I threw a fit. Crying, I kept repeating, "Don't like mean house, ugly house, scary house, mama, don't like." This reaction, she said, was entirely out of character for me. But after a few weeks, I stopped complaining, and my mom chalked it up to the stress of the move. The house was run down and located deep in the countryside. The kitchen, at the back of the house, still bore the scars of a recent fire caused by an old wood-burning stove. That fire had damaged part of the kitchen wall, which had only been partially repaired. On the second floor, right above the kitchen, there was a locked room. The landlord said it had severe fire damage, and though her son had done some repairs, he claimed the real damage was limited to the kitchen. Regardless, the room was off limits, and my parents never entered. Yet the locked door, right next to the upstairs landing, always gave them the creeps. I heard plenty of stories about the farmhouse growing up, especially about the creepy locked room. A few months after moving in, my mom and I were outside. She was hanging laundry while I played with our dog, Boss, a mix between a pit bull and a Doberman. Suddenly, Boss began barking wildly from a distance. Near the duck pond, about 500 yards away, he was frantically running back and forth between the house and the pond, barking the entire time. My mom noticed something thrashing in the water and sprinted toward the pond. By the time she arrived, Boss had already pulled me from the pond. I was soaked, though my mom had no idea how I got there in the first place. The pond was far away over my head and I couldn't swim. Baffled, she assumed I must have somehow slipped away and gotten into trouble. From then on, I was kept in baby gates and playpens. But the strangest incident happened a few weeks later. My mom was downstairs cooking. Boss was outside, Victor was napping in his crib, and I was secured in my playpen upstairs. She had placed baby gates across my bedroom door and at the top of the stairs to ensure I couldn't wander off. The kitchen was positioned so she could hear us if we cried or fussed. No more than 15 minutes after checking on us, Boss went wild in the yard again. My mom dashed upstairs to check on me. Victor was still asleep. The gates were all locked, but I wasn't in my room. A frantic search of the house revealed nothing. I had vanished. Panicked, my mother ran outside, where Boss was barking furiously, running circles in the yard. As soon as she stepped out, he took off toward the right, away from the pond. He led her nearly a mile and a half down a dirt road to a dense thicket of trees on our neighbor's property. The first thing that hit her was the stench, an overpowering odor of decay. Heart racing, she pushed through the trees and stumbled upon a grisly scene. Piles of corrugated tin, tarps, and tires, hiding the rotting remains of butchered cattle. The further she ventured into the thicket, the more horrifying the sight. Decomposing bones and flesh littered the ground, and there, in the middle of the carnage, I stood, just standing, staring around as if I were confused but calm. My mom rushed to me, checking to see if I was hurt. I wasn't. She asked me how I had gotten there, but with the seriousness only a toddler can muster, I simply told her, "The children brought me here." Horrified, she asked who these children were and where they were now. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "The ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs. I don't see them anymore." After that, I wouldn't say another word about it. No matter how many times she asked, I remained silent. To this day, my mother remains convinced that what happened that day was impossible. There was no way I could have known about the slaughter yard, let alone escaped from my room, bypassing every baby gate and getting outside, only to travel almost 2 miles into that hidden thicket in such a short amount of time. I was a slow, clumsy toddler. The incident still haunts her, and she's glad I don't remember it. As for me, I've often wondered what really happened that day. Maybe it's better not to know. Whatever those children were, I'm certain they weren't human.